Welcome to LaSalle University's MBA Forum. With us today is Professor Charles Fornaciari, who will be talking about writing case studies in MBA courses. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Professor Fornaciari.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, John. So just as a little bit of a background about me, my area is business strategy. So for those of you who will have me for a course, it'll probably be for MBA 902, the capstone course. And business strategy itself is a very heavily case-oriented course at most universities, and especially here at LaSalle. So this is a little bit of the background from my perspective as somebody who's been using cases for a long, long time. I don't even want to think about how many years it's been, but it's been decades. So my conversation today is going to be more about getting started with case analyses. So if you have an undergraduate degree in business or you're well into the program, some of this information may be new to you. But I think it's also good is just a refresher. One of the things I'm going to point out before I begin, and you'll see this later on in a slide, is that cases are very flexible teaching and learning tools. So what I'm going to give you is a broad overview today. As always, different professors use cases in different ways. And so the best advice is always to make sure that you follow the guidance of how your professor is asking you to use these cases in courses. So with that, we'll begin. So let's just start. And again, if there's any questions, feel free at any point in time just to hop in and ask me a question. So let's just start a little bit by looking at what is a case? So this is a textbook I use at the undergraduate level. It is Thompson, Patterath, Gamble, and Strickland. Some of you may see this in your MBA course. This is a textbook on strategic management. Again, strategy tends to be a course that uses a lot of cases. So here's the definition that the textbook gives. And I think it's a very good definition. It is also very similar that you're going to find in almost any text or any reading about what is a case. So really quickly, as you can see here, it says a case sets forth in a factual manner the events and organizational circumstances surrounding a particular managerial situation. It puts readers at the scene of the action and familiarizes them with all the relevant circumstances. The essence of a student's role in case analysis is to diagnose and size up the situation described in the case and to recommend appropriate action steps. So before we break that down into its component parts, just a little bit about a history of how we began using cases in higher education. For the most part, if you're new to case analysis, where most of us will be very familiar without even being aware of it, is law schools. Law schools were among the first to use cases. And if you've ever seen a video or a TV show of two lawyers standing in front of a judge and jury, trying to convince the judge or the jury that they had the best interpretation of whatever the circumstances were, whether that was criminal law or civil law. And so the way that law schools began was giving cases and essentially having students argue the facts and defend their answers. So the format has been with us for a very, very long time. And at its core, what we see here is that you are trying to make an argument, a reasoned argument. Business schools didn't take long to adopt this process. So we've been seeing business schools using them for quite a long time. There are some schools that teach almost exclusively using case analyses. One institution I know of in particular, the average student sees almost 300 cases over their course of their enrollment. So it's a very powerful tool for teaching and learning. It's been around with us for a long time. And the idea here is at its core, it's really a structured argument. So let's just take a moment and look at some of the pieces of a case from that definition and going a little bit beyond the definition. So as you got from the previous slide, cases are almost always grounded in the facts and circumstances of the presented situation. So what we see here is the starting point, especially in schools of business, is that your arguments, your analyses always have to be grounded in those facts and those circumstances. That part sounds easy until you go to the second point, which is that cases are often ambiguous by design. There's key facts that are missing. There are key facts that may be in conflict with one another. There may be hidden assumptions in the case. So the idea of a case analysis is beginning to understand both the facts and trying to line up all the pieces together to make sense of the situation. So a big part of case analyses are trying to essentially just make sense of the story that's in front of you. As an MBA student, this is something that you actually should seek and value. As I tell a lot of my students, if we take a look at corporate America, there's a reason why, and I believe it was 2014, the average Fortune 500 CEO's salary was $10 million a year, because the problems they're being paid to solve are incredibly ambiguous and incredibly complex. So if you're looking for simple solutions and simple cases, corporate America doesn't pay well for them. So again, another good example of why we use cases. As I hinted a little bit earlier on, they're often very complex once we get into the world of organizations. And I used corporate America earlier on, but we can take a look at this for nonprofits, NGOs. They're often complex. And again, that's what we find in the real world. We really want to begin to think that there are things in organizations that collide from goals and objectives and all sorts of different things. Organizations can be very messy places. The final part, especially for those of you who are just starting your MBA program, is that they're decision-oriented. One of the things that is a hallmark of an MBA program is that we are training managers, and managers get paid to make decisions. So almost any goal of any case is to get you to focus on making a decision. So before I move on, are there any questions about cases in general before we start talking about case analyses and how to approach a case? Okay, so we're good. So let's move on to the next slide. So for me, there are a couple of key elements to a case analysis. And once again, I always recommend that you talk to your professors to get their unique guidance. What I'm presenting here is pretty much the universal generalized approach to case analyses. Different professors are definitely going to have distinct requirements, and so it's always best to ask them what they're looking for. So the starting point of any case analysis is effectively identifying the key issue or key problem that is presented in the case. Some cases may have multiple issues. Some cases may have just one. But the idea, and if you take a look at a case, some cases are as short as 2 or 3 pages. Some cases are 30 pages. And as you read through that, and you want to read through it probably a couple of times before you begin doing the work, is ask yourself, what's the key issue? What's the key problem I'm being asked to identify and then ultimately resolve here? Something else that we find in cases is that you're often going to be asked to identify key facts and, if necessary, key assumptions. This is a big thing about case analysis. They are always going to have areas where in your mind they're incomplete. You want more data, you want more information. Again, this mirrors the real world. Managers do not operate under perfect information. And so here, you're going to want to state your key assumptions. So if there's a piece of information that's missing, you're going to want to see if there's a key assumption that is being woven throughout the case, or there's a key assumption that you're making. The third part is you're, as a decision-oriented tool, you're going to want to provide distinct and realistic alternatives to potentially solve the problem. So the idea here is you want to identify the problem, you want to look at the facts and the assumptions that underlie that problem, and then you want to begin moving on to what are the potential ways that we could resolve this problem. And again, in the real world, you often want to give your manager more than one choice. So you want to give distinct and realistic alternatives. If your alternative requires $1 billion in spending for a $50 million company, it's not realistic. If your alternative requires the organization to do it in a week and it's a 5-year project, it's not realistic. So again, it's got to be realistic to the company itself. The next part is selecting and justifying one of the alternatives as the recommended course of action for resolving the problem. Again, this is the decision part. So for most case analyses, you're going to be evaluated, at least in part, about how well you defend and justify here's the direction we should go. And that is a key part of case analysis. You're making your case, no pun intended, about the future course of action. The last part, and I can tell you in my many years of teaching, students often tend to overlook this last part of case analysis, is providing a clear and realistic implementation plan for putting the recommendation into action. This is in some ways the easiest part of a case analysis, but in some ways it's the most difficult. You're going to want to be able, to the extent possible, supported by the case, provide timelines, who's responsible, estimate costs, look at the realism of this. And that's, in real world, as in cases, a very, very tough thing to do. But you really want to demonstrate that you've thought that you have a true path forward for putting this into action. You also want to avoid generic answers. So for example, one of the things that I will often see in case analysis is the implementation plan is to go out and hire a consultant to study the problem. The case analysis by design is asking you to solve the problem. So if your solution involves hiring a consultant to study and identify the problem, you've essentially avoided your key responsibility in a case analysis. So that last part is really about making sure that you give a very clear, very realistic implementation plan. And most professors are going to ask for as much detail as possible connected to that case. So again, no matter what course you're in, you're going to see pretty much these steps. And again, other professors may vary their requirements, but you're almost always going to see this. What's the problem? What are the key facts and assumptions? What are the possible ways of addressing this problem? Picking one of those alternatives as a solution, and then providing a path forward. One of the things you're also going to notice too in many case analyses is that your write-ups are often short, but that in some ways makes it more challenging because you're trying to make the best use of your manager's time. And many managers in cases won't ask for more than 2 or 3 pages, which means every word that you're going to write, or even when you present, if you're doing a presentation, it's going to be very clear, very direct. So again, just a reminder of the key steps. Any questions on that one? All right, so let's just take a look at the last slide. So just some case analysis tips. And again, this applies whether or not you're doing a written presentation or some form of presentation that's oral or video recorded. As I stated up front, they are by design and by nature very flexible tools. So again, always ask your professor's preferences for items like update research. Cases, almost by definition, the moment you read them, are older. Some may be only a year old. Some may be 2 years old. Some professors will take the approach that you have to update the case to be current as of today. Other professors say, no, just stay within the bounds of the case as presented. Each approach has its own unique advantages, and different professors will clearly have different preferences. So that's always something you want to ask. Do you want us to update this case before we do the analysis by doing research, or should we just stay within the format of what's presented within that case? Lots of different analysis formats. Again, you may see some professors asking for longer answers, some for shorter answers, but there's almost always some sort of format. Again, especially at the MBA level, page length. If you remember your undergraduate years, you may have struggled to get to a 5-page paper in your sophomore year of college. By the time we hit the MBA program, if you want a 30-page paper, I can give you a 30-page paper. But often what you'll see in MBA programs is maximum lengths, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. So again, you always want to be really clear with your professor. Is there a maximum or a minimum length? Something that I find many students really appreciate is that cases are almost always selected to illustrate some key class concept. So if you're looking at a consumer behavior class and you've just done some theory of consumer behavior in marketing, the case is probably going to be connected to that theory. If you're sitting in a strategy class and we just did a 5 forces analysis, understanding the ideas of a 5 forces analysis will almost always help you do the case. So again, see if you can connect that case to a concept. Almost always the professors will tell you, but they won't always tell you. So again, but realize cases are designed to help you demonstrate your knowledge and your ability to apply concepts in the class that you've covered. The third one that I've said a couple of times, but it bears repeating, a case analysis essentially involves trying to convince someone senior, your boss, the board of directors, depending on the format of the case, that you have identified a problem and have a path forward. So going back to our earlier conversations about how cases began in law schools, it's the same thing here. This is a decision-oriented, problem-solving kind of situation. Business schools are just as interested as law schools, and in some ways more. Law schools are trying to win an argument. We're trying to convince a boss that we have a decision and a problem solved. Something you want to be very careful of with cases, and number 4, we often see when students write cases that before they've begun writing the case, they already have their answer, and they try and twist the case to match their answer. We often say it's an answer in search of a problem. So you want to make sure that you avoid, especially up front, your problem statement that has the embedded answer. You're trying to set this up as a generic problem. Some classes, those problems will be narrowly focused. Some classes, they'll be more generally focused. But you don't want to have the question or the problem with the answer embedded in it. So the question of how do we move that box to the other side of the building has an embedded answer in it. That's a poor example. But again, you don't want to tip your answer in the question, because then you have just skewed the rest of the analysis. Another one that is really important, especially in an MBA class, is that many of us have been trained from our prior education and some of our degrees to look for the right or wrong answer. Cases by design rarely have a right or wrong answer. What they're looking for is the demonstration of your business reasoning aligned with the case's facts and situation. You want to show that you understand the facts. You want to demonstrate sound business thinking. So if you've been exposed to an idea in class, a concept, and you don't use that concept well, that's a problem. So again, this is an argument, and it's almost always about the quality of the argument. And most professors are going to be scoring in one form or another about how good the argument is, not whether the answer is right or wrong. In many case situations, we don't know the answer until a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I can tell you in a course right now, we are talking about Tesla, and will Tesla be around in 5 years? And what is Tesla's future? And none of us know that right now, but there are lots of answers that are based on good evidence that will agree or disagree. So again, make sure that you're building an argument and not just simply searching for a right or wrong answer. The next one is that alternatives should be distinct and realistic. You're trying to give senior management, your boss, whoever it is, choices, and you're trying to give them clear and distinct choices. And in particular, we go back to this realism. Whatever you're doing, make sure that it's realistic to the situation provided. And then again, I've made this point before. I often see students in case analyses gloss over the action plan. It may be a great idea, but if it can't be put into practice realistically for the organization, that's going to be problematic. So you really want to begin thinking about the action plan. How long is this going to take? Who's responsible? What's the cost? What are the time frames for each element? How do the elements fit together? How do resources get allocated? So again, you really want to be very careful about not just glossing over the action plan. In some ways, as I said earlier on, it's the easiest part of the case to do, but in other parts, it is much more difficult because it really involves a deep understanding of the situation there. So there is a quick 10, 15-minute overview of cases. Any questions? Nicole, I see your light blinking, but you're muted.
I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Any questions from anybody else?
Great. Well, we have recorded today's session so we can share your knowledge with all of our students that were unable to attend this afternoon. And thank you very much, Professor Fornaciari, for joining us and teaching us about case studies.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good day, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.